Goal this week provoked a storm of controversy by calling for the Champions League to change its selection criteria, as too many clubs are penalised by the current format. To test the theory, we held an entirely free draw.
Chelsea.
No seedings, no coefficients.
Group D.
No same country exemptions.
Barcelona.
Simply 32 teams selected into 8 groups entirely at random.
Man City.
So Pete, there's the draw, 8 intriguing groups and fascinating ties, but first take us through the rationale of why you did the draw in this way.
Well, we had a discussion all together and we perceived somewhat of a bias, maybe some favouritism towards the traditional elite teams in the Champions League every year. You know, you've got that same band of teams, the likes of, which includes the likes of Arsenal and Manchester United, who perhaps haven't been performing as strong as they used to in the competition over the past year or two, but still have enough coefficient points built in the eyes of UEFA to maintain their standing as a Pot 1 team. Now, while there's teams like Borussia Dortmund, Paris St-Germain and Juventus in particular, who are still struggling to break into that Pot 1 because of the likes of Arsenal and Man United being in there. And we think it'd be a little bit more fair if teams like that were given a better chance to establish themselves as Pot 1 teams earlier and sooner than they currently are.
5 years, Dennis, do you think that is too long, looking back?
Looking back, yeah, it probably is, and I think 3 would be acceptable. I understand where Pete's coming from, but I think you could get in a process of where you end up with the not so good teams in the quarterfinals playing against the top teams, and I think everyone wants to see the 2 top teams or the 8 top teams playing against each other. And okay, it's a bit biased in the way that it's panned out, because I think the 2. You'd be able to pick the 2 top teams out of each group that's going to go through. I think it's quite straightforward, and maybe one will get in and knock one of the top teams out. But myself, I prefer the way that it's done at the present moment. Maybe cut it down to 3 years. I think that would be acceptable. And but I like to see the top teams in the quarterfinals playing each other. I think it's more exciting.
So Pete, we've got our very own group of death, despite the random draw. Olympiacos, Barcelona, Napoli and Juventus, much like, of course, the group of death from the real Champions League last time around. It's quite counterintuitive, isn't it, with the setup as it is, to still pit champions against champions?
Yeah, well, UEFA do have these mechanisms to ensure that the groups are distributed evenly and you get clubs of different rankings all competing against each other. They also ensure that teams from the same national association don't now end up facing each other, as Juventus and Napoli have done here. But one thing that UEFA seem to have overlooked is the fact that champions can play champions. Of course, in the Champions League last year, we had the champions of Germany, of Spain, of England and the Netherlands all facing each other. And if they're going to safeguard against these things happening in the Champions League, it should be from champions facing champions.
Man City benefiting from a kind draw for a change, but it kind of underlines your point earlier, doesn't it? That why do teams like that, runners-up in their domestic league, not a very good Champions League performance last time around, why are they prioritised over a team like Juventus, champions of their league, and a good cup run last time?
Well, crucially, Man City were in the Champions League for a season longer than Juventus were on this current run, and that's how City built up a greater coefficient average. So therefore, they leapfrog Juventus into a higher pot. Sometimes
seedings don't matter, though, do they, Dennis? As we've seen a number of times.
No, I don't think they do. Sometimes, you know, I think as the group of death, you're talking about Dortmund when they was in the group of death, and they get to the final, you know. And I think Monaco was another team that actually was in the lower seeded. But still got to the final. So I think if the teams have got the quality there, they will get through anyway. And I think obviously Monaco and Dortmund have shown that.
Pete, take Group E, hardly the most enticing on paper. That's the risk, isn't it, with a draw like this?
Yeah, it is. We see in open cup competitions sometimes, one element of the draw might be weaker than the other, and it does mean that teams who don't usually get the exposure of a last 16 or a quarter final, they have the chance to go a little bit further, earn a bit more money, and give themselves a little bit more relevance on that world stage. And by keeping the biggest teams apart and filtering them into the last 16 in the way that UEFA probably wants for TV revenue, it does deny these smaller teams that opportunity. So a weaker group, while it might be the most enticing prospect from a television perspective or from a stadium perspective, can still be good to deliver new teams to the latter stages of the competition.
We can blame the governing bodies. We could say it's all about money, Dennis, but isn't that what we want as well? We want to see a last 8 with all the big heavyweight teams in.
We want to see the sexy teams, don't we, in the last 8. We want to see all the big teams playing each other. And you flick a coin up and you think, who's going to win this year?
So Pete, what are the practical options and considerations moving forward, do you think?
I think 5 years is too long, because teams are essentially punished for the acts of previous incarnations of that club going back 5 seasons. I mean, why should Juventus still be paying for the fact that they went out of the Europa League to Fulham when they, were undefeated in the Champions League group stage last season and put the holders out? By the same token, I think a season or two based on the coefficients would be ideal. At least then we would have a more accurate picture of who the strongest clubs around are, and it would reward the clubs instantaneously for their decent European form. The other option we have is what we've just done: free draw right from the off. Once you get your 32 qualified teams in the way that UEFA want to qualify them, that's fine. Put them into an open draw. Best team is going to finish on top.
Thanks very much, guys. For analysis on the Champions League group stage draw, head on over to Goal.